Experience the kinetic glow of a life in constant motion, where every action creates a ripple that changes the world forever. Our cinematic visuals capture the heat and the energy of those who lived every moment to the fullest. Hit subscribe now and feel the power of motion.
My son-in-law told a room full of his colleagues that I was just a retired plumber who couldn't read a balance sheet. He said it into a microphone at my grandson's christening while I was sitting 12 feet away. What he didn't know was that the building his law firm occupied downtown, all 22 floors of it, had been sending me a check for $1.8 million every year since 2019. By the time the baptismal water dried, I had already decided that his arrogance was going to cost him everything he thought he'd built. My name is Robert Callahan. I'm 64 years old and I've been underestimated my entire life. I want to tell you what happened last spring at St. Michael's Parish Hall in Charleston, South Carolina, and why I don't regret a single thing I did. My daughter brought my son-in-law home for the first time 3 years ago, Thanksgiving week. His name is Derek. He drove a leased BMW, wore a blazer to a turkey dinner, and spent the first 20 minutes asking me careful questions about my career the way a doctor asks about symptoms politely, but already forming a conclusion. She had told him I was retired. He assumed he understood what that meant. When I told him I'd spent 30 years in the trades, starting as a plumber's apprentice at 17, he nodded with that particular smile. Patient. Generous. The smile of a man filing information into a folder labeled Limited. He was a partner at a downtown corporate law firm, the kind of practice that represents developers and hedge funds, and people whose problems require expensive discretion. He was proud of what he'd built, and I respected that. What I didn't respect was the way he started treating my history, like an explanation for why I needed his help understanding things. The comments were never cruel outright. That's the thing about men like my son-in-law. They're too smart for cruelty. Instead, it was precision. At Christmas dinner that first year, when I mentioned I'd been looking at properties in the industrial corridor south of the city, he laughed and said, "Dad, that market is incredibly complex. You really need institutional knowledge to navigate it." He called me Dad like he was patting a child on the head. My daughter laughed softly and moved the conversation somewhere safer. I let it go. I let a lot of things go. When my grandson was born 18 months ago, I watched my son-in-law introduce me to his partners and their spouses at the hospital with the same formula every time. "This is Susan's father. Retired tradesman. Great guy. Very salt of the earth." Every time. Salt of the earth. Like I was a character in a story about humble people who meant well but couldn't quite keep up. My daughter stopped correcting him. That was the part that hurt most. I'd watch her face when he said it, and there would be this small flicker, something between apology and resignation, and then she'd smile and move on. She was trying to keep her marriage smooth. I understood that. I had been married for 31 years before my wife, Carol, passed. I knew what the work of marriage looked like from the inside. Carol had been my partner in everything. She was the one who spotted the first commercial opportunity, a vacant warehouse on the edge of the downtown district in 1994, when I had a decent plumbing business. 3 trucks, and enough saved to take a risk. "The trades teach you what buildings actually are," she told me. "You understand them from the inside out. Nobody sees value in these structures the way you do." She was right. We bought that warehouse for $340,000. We renovated it ourselves. I did most of the mechanical work, hired a structural engineer I trusted, and spent 8 months turning it into leasable commercial space. We sold it 4 years later for $1.1 million. We did it again. And again. Quietly. Carefully. Without debt we couldn't service. Without investors we didn't need. Carol handled the books, the leases, the relationships with our property management company. I sourced the buildings, evaluated the bones, managed the renovations. By the time she passed 6 years ago, Callahan Properties LLC owned 14 commercial buildings across the Charleston metro area. I spent the next 4 years continuing what we'd built together because that was the only way I knew how to honor her. The portfolio now stands at 23 properties. Total value, according to last year's appraisal, just over $210 million. I never told my daughter the full scope of it. We had our reasons, Carol and I. The same reasons most parents with quiet wealth have. We wanted her to build her own confidence, her own career, her own identity. She did. She's a nurse practitioner running her own practice. She earned every credential she has. We were proud of her in the specific way you're proud of someone who did it themselves. But she married a man who needed to be the most successful person in any room. And silence, I eventually learned, can be misread as confirmation. The christening was held on a Saturday in April. My grandson, 8 months old, completely indifferent to the ceremony around him, was dressed in the baptismal gown that had been in my wife's family for 4 generations. The parish hall reception afterward was the kind of gracious Southern event my son-in-law had been looking forward to. His partners were there, his managing partners, 2 federal judges he knew socially, about 90 guests in total, the kind of crowd where reputation is currency and first impressions compound. I arrived early to help set up, which my son-in-law had noted with visible discomfort. "You really don't have to do that, Dad," he'd said the night before. "We have a catering team." I came anyway. I carried chairs. I liked carrying chairs. I've never seen anything diminishing about useful work. The trouble began during the cocktail hour, when my son-in-law was holding court near the bar with 3 of his partners, and a man I didn't recognize but would later learn was a senior partner from their firm's parent organization in Atlanta, a man named Graham Mitchell who had flown in for the weekend. I was nearby, holding my grandson, when I heard the conversation shift toward commercial real estate. Their firm was apparently in the middle of a significant lease negotiation for their downtown office space. The building at 14 Meridian Street, 22 floors, primary location. I knew the building well. I'd owned it for 4 years. Graham Mitchell was asking about the ownership structure. "You know anything about the landlord entity?" he said. "We've been trying to get a face-to-face with someone at Callahan Properties for 6 months. Their management company keeps redirecting us." My son-in-law shook his head. "Shell company, probably. Some investor group out of Atlanta. Or Charlotte. These passive holding structures are everywhere now. Nobody local that size stays local." He swirled his glass. "Which is exactly why you need counsel who understands how to pressure a faceless LLC." He laughed. His colleagues laughed. I kept my face neutral and looked down at my grandson, who was grabbing my collar with great seriousness. 10 minutes later, my son-in-law found an audience, the way he always found an audience, and gave the performance I should have anticipated. He had been drinking since noon, which loosened the precision he usually kept around his condescension. He called for attention, tapped his glass, and gave a toast to his son. It was warm for the first 2 minutes. And then it turned. "I want to say something about family," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. "About where we come from. Susan grew up in a household of honest, hard-working people. Her father," he gestured toward me with his glass, "spent his career keeping the pipes running, making sure the lights stayed on. The invisible work that holds everything together." Polite murmurs. People were still smiling. "Now, Robert will be the first to tell you he doesn't understand the world Susan and I work in. Corporate law, commercial development, institutional finance. It's a different language." He laughed lightly. "And that's fine. That's perfectly fine. Not everyone is built for that world." He raised his glass higher. "What matters is that Susan came from people who worked hard with their hands and never asked for more than they earned. That kind of humility," he paused for effect, "is exactly why she turned out the way she did. Because she had to rise above her circumstances on her own terms." The room applauded. A few people looked at me with kind expressions. The expressions people give a dignified dog who has just been complimented on his temperament. My daughter was watching me from across the room. Her face had that flicker again, but this time it didn't resolve into a smile. I handed my grandson to his great-aunt, picked up my jacket from the back of my chair, and walked to the microphone stand that the catering team had set up near the small podium. My son-in-law was still standing at the front of the room. He saw me coming, and his expression shifted barely. But I'd been reading people for 64 years. "I don't want to interrupt the celebration," I said into the microphone. The room was already quiet. But since Derek brought up the subject of work and ambition and what we pass on to the next generation, I'd like to add something. My son-in-law relaxed slightly. He thought I was going to offer a gracious counterpoint, that I was going to affirm his narrative with different words, that I was going to be salt of the earth. I reached into my jacket pocket and set a business card on the podium. Small, clean, white cardstock with navy letters. Derek, you mentioned the lease negotiation at 14 Meridian Street. His expression changed. I've been meaning to properly introduce myself to Graham Mitchell. I looked toward the Atlanta partner. Mr. Mitchell, my name is Robert Callahan. Callahan Properties has been your firm's landlord for 4 years. The silence in that room was the kind that has texture. You could feel people recalibrating. Graham Mitchell set his glass down slowly. I'm sorry? Callahan Properties, LLC. We own 14 Meridian. We also own the parking structure on Commerce that your firm uses, and the building on East Bay where your litigation support vendor operates. I slid the business card across the podium toward him. Your people have been trying to reach us through our property management company. I apologize for the delay. I prefer to handle things in person. My son-in-law had stopped breathing. I could see it from where I was standing. Graham Mitchell walked to the podium, picked up the card, and read it. He read it twice. Then he looked at Derek with an expression that was entirely professional, and therefore entirely devastating. Derek, he said quietly, did you know about this? Derek's mouth opened. Nothing came out. My daughter had moved closer. She was standing 15 feet away now, very still. I should have introduced myself properly from the beginning, I said to the room, not unkindly. That's on me. Carol, my wife, who passed 6 years ago, she always said I was too comfortable being invisible. I paused. She built this company with me. Started in 1994 with a single warehouse, 23 properties now. I still carry chairs because I like carrying chairs. But I do understand balance sheets. One of Derek's partners, a woman named Helen, who had always been pleasant at family events, put her hand over her mouth. Not from cruelty. From the specific shock of watching a narrative collapse in real time, Derek found his voice. This isn't Dad. I don't understand how you... He stopped, recalculated. And then, because he was who he was, he chose the wrong door. Can we verify this? Because frankly, this seems... Derek. Graham Mitchell's voice was quiet and absolute. I'm just saying, Derek. Stop. The room had the quality of a held breath. I pulled a folded document from my inner jacket pocket. I had brought it not because I planned to use it, I had hoped I wouldn't, but because Carol had taught me that preparation is just another form of respect for your own work. This is the deed of ownership for 14 Meridian Street, recorded with the Charleston County Register of Deeds, December 2020, Callahan Properties, LLC, sole owner. I said it on the podium. Your current lease runs through March 2027. Annual rent, $1.8 million. Graham Mitchell picked up the document. He spent 30 seconds reading it. Then he straightened up, buttoned his jacket, and extended his hand to me. Mr. Callahan, I apologize that we haven't met sooner. I've heard your company's name in connection with half the quality commercial inventory in this city. Carol deserves most of the credit for that reputation, I said. She had standards I'm still trying to live up to. Derek sat down heavily in the nearest chair. His face was the color of old chalk. What happened next was not the moment I would have chosen. But Derek chose it. He stood back up. Whatever composure training his legal career had given him had burned away entirely, and what was underneath was something smaller and more frightened than the man who had toasted me 20 minutes ago. He walked to the center of the room and addressed the guests with the desperation of someone trying to reframe a story while the frame is still falling. I want everyone to understand something, he said, his voice too loud for the space. I don't know what documentation he has, but I've been negotiating this lease for 2 years, and in 2 years, nobody at Callahan Properties has identified themselves as, that's because I communicate through my property management company, I said calmly. The same way you communicate through associates. We're not so different in that respect. You deliberately hid this from me." His voice cracked on the word deliberately. "I didn't hide anything. I just didn't announce it." I looked at him steadily. "There's a difference, Derek. You assumed you already knew everything worth knowing about me. I didn't correct the assumption because I was waiting to see what kind of man you actually were." My daughter said his name. Just once. "Derek." He turned to her. "Susan, you have to see what's happening here. Your father, just in front of my colleagues." "My father," she said slowly, "just introduced himself. That's what happened. The reception didn't recover. It didn't need to. My grandson, blissfully unbothered by all of it, had fallen asleep on his great-aunt's shoulder and looked like a small philosopher who had already resolved the questions the rest of us were still working through. Graham Mitchell spent 40 minutes talking with me after the room had loosened back into smaller conversations. He was a sharp, direct man who asked about our vacancy rates, our capital reserve approach, and our strategy on the 2 properties we'd acquired the previous year in the North Charleston corridor. I liked him. He had the quality of someone who recalibrates quickly and without drama. As he was leaving, he shook my hand at the door. "We'd like to discuss a lease extension well ahead of the 2027 expiration," he said. "Under the right terms, we'd consider expanding our footprint in this market. I'd like that conversation to be directly with you." "Call the property management company," I said. "Tell them Graham Mitchell. Direct to Robert. They'll put you through." He smiled. "I'll do that." Derek didn't speak to me at the end of the evening. He was standing near the bar with a glass he wasn't drinking, watching the room with the expression of someone calculating the diameter of a hole they've fallen into. I walked past him on my way to help fold the extra chairs, and I stopped. "For what it's worth," I said quietly, low enough that only he could hear, "I never wanted this to happen this way. I wanted you to be the kind of man my daughter deserved. I gave you 3 years to show me that." He looked at me. Something moved across his face that I couldn't name. It wasn't quite remorse, but it was in that neighborhood. "The lease renewal is going to go fine," I said. "I separate business from personal. Always have." I picked up a folding chair. "The rest is between you and Susan." The rest, it turned out, had already been decided. My daughter called me the following Tuesday morning. She was at her practice, between patients, and she spoke with the careful precision of someone who has been drafting a sentence in her head for several days. "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Always. Did you know what the christening was going to turn into? Did you plan it?" I thought about that for a moment. "I brought the deed because I've learned to carry documentation for things I know the value of." I didn't plan the toast he gave. She was quiet. "I should have defended you. A long time ago. At Christmas, at his firm's dinner last year, at the hospital when Thomas was born. I kept telling myself, it was easier to let it go. You were protecting your marriage. I was protecting his comfort." Her voice was precise and clear. "That's different." We were both quiet for a moment. "Your mother would have handled it much sooner than I did," I said. "I want you to know that the way you handle hard things reminds me of her every time." She made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a cry. "Dad, how much of our life did you and Mom build that I didn't know about?" "All of it, really. That was the design. We wanted you to build yours, without the weight of ours, in the background." "Did it work? You're a nurse practitioner who owns her practice and raised my grandson in a home she bought herself," I said. "What do you think?" She filed for a legal separation 4 weeks later. Derek hired a lawyer not from his own firm, for obvious reasons, and initially claimed that my deliberate concealment of assets had materially affected the conditions of the marriage. That argument lasted exactly as long as it took his attorney to review the corporate structure and realize that Callahan Properties had been established 18 years before my daughter married Derek, had always been held separately from any marital estate, and had been documented with the kind of fastidious consistency that 30 years of careful business practice produces. The attorney reportedly advised Derek to pursue a straightforward dissolution. He took the advice. Graham Mitchell did call. We met at the property management office on a Thursday morning in June, and the conversation about the lease extension took about 40 minutes. We agreed in principle to a 5-year renewal with an option for additional square footage on the upper floors. He brought a bottle of good bourbon when the terms were finalized, which I appreciated. "I want to ask you something personal," he said before he left. "Go ahead. Why didn't you say anything sooner? Not just at the christening." Over the years, I thought about Carol. About the night we bought that first warehouse. Sitting in the parking lot afterward eating sandwiches from a gas station because we'd spent every available dollar on the down payment. About what she'd said. "Nobody needs to know how big this gets. We just need to know. That's enough." My wife believed that real success doesn't need a room to perform in, I said. She was right most of the time. I paused. She also said that if anyone ever genuinely disrespected our family, I should make sure they understood exactly who they'd done it to. Graham nodded slowly. Smart woman. The smartest person I've ever known. My daughter's second year as a single parent was harder than the first, and then it got easier the way hard things do when the person doing them is fundamentally capable. She hired a second nurse practitioner at her practice. She took Thomas to visit Carol's parents in Savannah for a week in the summer, and from the photos she sent, my grandson spent most of his time sitting in garden dirt with the focused intensity of a scientist. He had Carol's forehead, that slight forward lean when something interested him. About 8 months after the separation, my daughter started mentioning a name. His name was Paul. He was a structural engineer. She mentioned it almost apologetically the first time, as if she expected me to find it too close to my own history, who had done seismic assessment work on a hospital she partnered with. He was 41, divorced with no children, and apparently very good at sitting with uncertainty, which my daughter described as the quality she'd decided mattered most. She brought him to Sunday dinner on a cold evening in November. He arrived 10 minutes early, brought a decent bottle of wine and an absolutely unnecessary amount of cheese, shook my hand like someone who'd been taught that handshakes are information, and spent the first few minutes looking at the framed photographs on the mantel with genuine interest. "Is this Charleston Harbor?" he said, pointing to one of Carol's photos from 1998. "Just south of it. We had a warehouse project along that waterfront." He turned around. "Callahan Properties? I've done structural assessments on 2 of your buildings." He looked genuinely pleased by the coincidence. "The work on those foundations is meticulous. Old Charleston construction with real integrity. I did some of the original work myself," I said. "I know. It shows." He said it without decoration, as a simple professional observation, like he was reporting data. We had dinner for 3 hours. He asked questions about foundation techniques in the Charleston climate, about how the transition from trade work to property development had changed the way I evaluated buildings, about what Carol had understood about real estate that I hadn't at first. He listened to the answers completely. The way engineers listen, processing, connecting, occasionally asking a follow-up that told you he'd actually heard what you said. After dessert, while my daughter was in the kitchen with Thomas, he leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Callahan, Susan has told me about the christening. About Derek." He paused. "I want you to know that I understand what your daughter is. I'm not here because of your company or your buildings or anything other than the person she is. I thought you should know I know the difference." I looked at him for a moment. "I believe you," I said. "But I'll know for certain in about 2 years." He smiled. "That seems fair. What I knew for certain much sooner was the thing that mattered more than any of the rest of it." When he got up to help clear the table, just got up, no announcement, no performance. The way people do when helping is simply the obvious thing. My daughter looked at him across the kitchen with an expression I recognized. Relaxed. Unguarded. The expression of someone who isn't managing a room. She hadn't looked like that in years. The understanding I want to pass on, the thing that the christening and everything that followed taught me in terms I hadn't fully articulated before, isn't really about Derek. He was a man who needed to be the most impressive presence in every room he entered. And when he discovered he wasn't, he broke badly. That's a painful way to be built. and I genuinely hope he's doing the work of becoming something different. What I learned was about the cost of staying invisible too long. Not invisible in Carol's sense, quiet, private, focused on the work rather than the performance. That kind of invisibility is a choice and a strategy, and it served us well for 30 years. I mean the other kind. The kind where you let someone else's narrative about you go unchallenged because challenging it feels like trouble, feels like disruption, feels like the kind of scene you've always been too proud to make. My silence had not been neutral. In the years of Sunday, dinners and firm events and hospital corridors, my silence had been misread as confirmation. And my daughter had slowly started confirming it too, not because she believed it, but because she was watching me not resist it. And she took that as instruction. She had my wife's instincts. She had Carol's intelligence and Carol's work ethic and Carol's capacity for loyalty that goes further than it should sometimes. What she needed to see from me, and didn't see for too long, was Carol's other instruction, the one about genuine disrespect. I've thought about the moment I stood up at that microphone more than I expected to in the months since. Whether I should have chosen differently. Whether there was a way to handle it that preserved more. I don't think so. The version of that day where I sat quietly through Derek's toast and let 90 people receive the story he was telling, that version would have been the last version. It would have calcified into permanent fact. My grandson would have grown up in a family where his grandfather was the construction worker with the good heart who didn't quite understand the world his parents moved in. That was never who Carol and I built ourselves to be. It was never who we raised our daughter to be. And it is not who Thomas Callahan is going to grow up thinking his family is. Last month I spoke at a community development panel at the College of Charleston, one of those forums about revitalizing the old industrial corridor south of the city. There were developers in the room, city council staff, a few young architects and engineers just starting out. Afterward, a young man came up to me, 26, maybe 27, the kind of careful, attentive quality that reminds you of people who are paying for their education twice, once in tuition and once in the extra effort it costs to be there without a family network behind you. He said he'd been doing Finnish carpentry to pay for his master's program in real estate development. He said people in his program sometimes talked about the trades like they were a prior life to be moved past rather than a foundation to build on. I handed him a card. When you graduate, I said, call me. Not because I'm doing you a favor, because people who understand what buildings actually are from the inside, from the bones, are the people I want involved in what comes next. He looked at the card for a moment. Then he looked up. I'll call, he said. I believed him, and I believed that Carol, somewhere in the particular silence she occupies now, was satisfied with how the story turned out. Not because the arrogant man was humbled. That part was almost beside the point, but because our daughter stood in a parish hall on a Saturday afternoon and told her husband, with 3 words and a steady voice, that he had said enough. That's what 30 years of quiet building produces, if you do it right. Not just the buildings, the people. That's worth more than proving anything to anyone. It always has been.